This is Sherlock Mysteries, where sharp minds uncover hidden motives. Kindly like and subscribe to Sherlock Mysteries. Which part of the world are you watching from? Tonight's mystery awaits. Chapter: I fay the alley without rain. It was within a quarter hour of midnight when the keen cry of a constable's whistle cleft the murmur of Fleet Street and set the small crowd into a nervous eddy. Holmes and I had been returning from a late consultation at the Temple when the sound reached us, shrill, urgent, unmistakably official. My companion altered his course at once, gliding toward the disturbance with that swift, silent stride which always suggested to me a hound catching scent upon the wind. The alley into which we were admitted was one of those narrow arteries that vein the district behind the newspaper offices. Dark, constricted, and perpetually smelling of ink, damp rope, and refuse. The lamps at either end cast a weak yellow gleam that failed to penetrate the deeper recesses. There, upon the cobbles midway down, lay a man. He was on his back, his head turned slightly toward the brick wall, as though in the last instant of life he had sought to confide in its rough surface. His boots were angled unevenly. One heel twisted beneath him, the other extended in a manner that suggested the beginning of a backward step. A dark bloom had spread across the front of his waistcoat, glistening faintly in the lamplight. I required no closer inspection to know that he had been shot cleanly through the chest. Beside him lay an open umbrella. It was not merely dropped, but spread wide, its black silk canopy fully extended, the handle resting upon the stones with curious deliberation. It struck me at once as incongruous, like a loyal hound crouched faithfully at its master's side. Yet the sky above was untroubled, a vault of unbroken darkness in which the stars shone with cold precision. The air was still, not a drop of rain had fallen that evening. Inspector Bradshaw of Scotland Yard, whom I knew slightly, stood near the body with a face of perplexity. He greeted Holmes with a nod that held both relief and resignation. "You are come at a fortunate moment, Mr. Holmes. We have here a most singular business." Holmes made no reply. He had already dropped to one knee beside the corpse, his long, nervous fingers hovering just above the stones before settling lightly upon them. His head bent forward, and I observed that peculiar abstraction steal over his features, the look of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. The gathered witnesses, clerks, compositors, and a pair of newsboys clustered at the mouth of the alley. Their expressions were pale with excitement. "What have you learned?" I asked the inspector quietly. "The deceased is Mr. Edwin Harcourt," Bradshaw replied, "a publisher of some modest standing offices in Salisbury Court. He left them at 11:45, so we are told. Within minutes a shot was heard. Several persons swear that a sudden shower drove them under the awnings. When they ventured out again, the man was found as you see him." A shower. I glanced upward again, as though the sky might offer contradiction. "Just so yet. Look about you." Holmes's voice came softly from where he knelt. "Indeed. Look about you, Watson." I followed his gesture. The cobbles were dry, not merely free of standing water, but filmed with a fine layer of dust and grit. The gutters at either side of the alley were thick with undisturbed refuse, cigarette stubs, paper fragments, a crust of grime that no recent rain could have spared. Holmes rose and moved slowly about the scene. He passed his hand along the brick wall at shoulder height. His fingertips came away dry and faintly powdered with soot. He examined the umbrella without touching it, his keen eyes tracing the line of its ribs. "Curious," he murmured. "Most curious." "Surely," said Inspector Bradshaw. "The witnesses cannot all be mistaken. There was some sudden fall, brief, perhaps localized." Holmes gave a faint smile. "My dear Inspector, meteorology does not indulge in such caprice. Rain leaves its signature upon stone and dust alike. There is here no signature." He turned to the nearest witness, a young compositor with ink-stained cuffs. "You observed a shower, sir?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. It came on all at once, sharp and cold. I heard it patter on the awning above me. I took shelter at once." "And you saw the deceased before you sought shelter?" "He passed by not a minute before. Yet we find it now fully extended." Holmes's tone was mild, almost conversational. "Pray continue." How long did this shower persist? Half a minute. No more. Then the shot rang out, while it rained. The young man hesitated. I cannot be certain. It was all confusion. Holmes nodded thoughtfully and dismissed him with a courteous inclination of the head. He next examined the body more closely. With my assistance, he turned back the lapel of the coat. The bullet had entered squarely through the heart. Death must have been instantaneous. No powder burns, Holmes observed. The shot was fired from a distance of several feet at least. Note also the angle, slightly downward. Our assailant stood either upon higher ground or was taller than the deceased. Inspector Bradshaw gestured vaguely toward the brick walls. There are no balconies, no windows low enough to account for it. Holmes paced the alley's length, counting steps beneath his breath. At one point he stooped and picked up a small object from near the gutter, a scrap of thin waxed paper. He examined it briefly and slipped it into his pocket without remark. "What do you make of the umbrella?" I asked. Holmes approached it at last, and bending low, inspected the ferrule. He gave a soft exclamation. "That is scarcely remarkable." On the contrary, Mr. Harcourt was known, I understand, for parsimonious habits. His clerk informs me that he would sooner mend a cracked teacup than replace it. Yet this umbrella is of recent manufacture and in excellent repair. Inspector Bradshaw cleared his throat. "What is your inference, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes rose, dusting his knees. His gaze swept once more across the silent stones. "The witnesses speak of rain," he said quietly. "Yet the night has been dry. They heard pattering overhead, but awnings are thin contrivances, easily persuaded to produce sound. A handful of small objects cast upon them would suffice." "Objects?" I echoed. "Gravel, perhaps, or pellets of some sort." Holmes's eyes shone now with that cold fire which signaled the sharpening of his faculties. "A diversion, my dear Watson. A contrived shower to drive observers beneath shelter and mask the report of..." Holmes arranged the chairs with almost clinical precision, placing each witness so that the light from the window fell fully upon his face. He himself remained half in shadow, long fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded, yet piercing. The first was the young compositor I had seen in the alley. He repeated his statement with commendable consistency. A sudden patter overhead, a dash beneath the awning, and the report of a pistol. "Did you feel the rain upon your person?" Holmes inquired. "I know, sir. It began just as I reached shelter." "You are certain it was rain?" "I heard it, sir." "Heard it," Holmes repeated gently. "And what precisely does rain sound like upon canvas?" The young man hesitated. "A tapping, sir, a steady tapping, like peas cast upon a drum." The witness blinked. "Perhaps, sir." Holmes inclined his head and dismissed him. The second witness, an elderly news vendor with rheumy eyes, proved more expansive. He insisted that a flash accompanied the shot. "A flash?" Holmes leaned forward. "From the sky, yes, sir. A white glare." "Was there lightning?" The man paused. "It might have been lightning. Or," Holmes suggested mildly, "the discharge of a firearm in a confined space." The vendor shifted uneasily. "It was all of a piece, sir. The rain, the light, the bang. Indeed." Holmes made a brief notation. The third, a clerk of nervous disposition, declared that he had smelled wet wool as he ducked beneath the awning. "Wet wool?" Holmes's brows rose. "And yet you yourself remained dry." "I suppose so. I did not examine my coat." Holmes did so at once. The garment, though worn at the cuffs, bore no sign of recent dampness. The hem was powdered faintly with street dust. Holmes lifted it delicately between finger and thumb. "You perceive, Watson," he remarked, "that dust adheres where water has not trespassed." Each witness, examined in isolation, told a tale of precipitation and panic, yet their details varied like instruments poorly tuned to a common melody. One recalled thunder, another denied it. One swore the rain fell in sheets, another that it was but a spatter. Their agreement lay only in the central pattern: a rush of rain, the crack of a gunshot, and a gentleman collapsing beneath the shelter of his own umbrella. When the last had departed, Holmes rose and crossed to the fireplace, where he stood gazing into the empty grate as though flames of inference burned there unseen. "Well," I ventured. "My dear Watson," said he softly, "you have witnessed a most instructive phenomenon. The human mind, when startled, seeks cohesion. One man hears an unexpected sound overhead. Another sees a flash. A third, primed by expectation, supplies the odor of damp wool. Each, in the retelling, adjusts his memory to accord with the others. Thus, a shower is born where none has fallen. You believe, then, that none felt actual rain?" Holmes turned sharply. "Examine their attire. Not one coat bore the darkened hem of recent wet. Not one hat brim wept upon the pavement. Their boots, when brought here, showed the same fine dust as last night's cobbles. The supposed storm has left no trace but memory." Inspector Bradshaw, who had listened in silence, cleared his throat. "Mass hysteria, then." "Mass suggestion," Holmes corrected. "A far subtler instrument, consider. A pattering sound upon awnings in Fleet Street. After 11, who expects such a sound? Why, rain, of course. The mind leaps to the familiar explanation. Each man, fearing to be soaked, seeks shelter. In that moment of confusion, a shot is fired." "And the flash?" the inspector asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "The discharge of a pistol will produce a brief illumination. In the narrow confines of that alley, it might well reflect against brick and canvas alike. Our news vendor's lightning is but chemistry misapprehended." I could not forbear a shiver. Then the murderer counted upon this. Undoubtedly, he required but seconds in which all eyes were turned upward or inward. He provided the sound of rain. The witnesses supplied the rest. Holmes resumed his seat and drew from his pocket the scrap of waxed paper he had recovered from the gutter. He unfolded it carefully upon the table. It was creased and faintly greasy, as though it had wrapped some small commodity. A fine dust clung to its surface, grains more uniform than ordinary street grit. "What do you observe?" Holmes asked. "Powder," I said, "but not gunpowder. Just so too coarse and too regular. Pellets perhaps wrapped and carried. For what purpose?" Holmes's eyes shone with quiet satisfaction. "To simulate rain." Inspector Bradshaw stared. "You mean he cast these pellets upon the awnings? Or caused them to fall in some other fashion? The sound need not be sustained, only sudden and convincing. A handful of small objects striking taut canvas would suffice." "But why such elaborate deception?" I asked. Holmes's expression sobered. "Because our murderer wished not merely to kill, but to shape perception. He desired that witnesses recall confusion, weather, lightning, anything but the true arrangement of the scene." "The true arrangement," Bradshaw echoed. Holmes leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Mr. Edwin Harcourt was shot from a measured distance by a man who had prepared both diversion and escape. The umbrella was opened at the first false sign of rain, rendering the victim momentarily blind to his surroundings. In that instant, he was struck." He paused, then added, "Yet the umbrella itself remains the most eloquent witness." "How so?" I inquired. Holmes regarded me keenly. "Because, Watson, Mr. Harcourt opened it at precisely the right moment. He expected rain. On a clear night." "On a clear night," Holmes repeated. "Which suggests either that he was unusually cautious, or that he had reason to anticipate precipitation of a very particular kind." The room fell silent. Outside, a hansom rattled past, its wheels humming over the stones. Inspector Bradshaw broke the quiet. "We have begun inquiries into Harcourt's affairs. He published political pamphlets and certain controversial tracts. There were disputes. Financial?" Holmes asked. "Some, also, legal threats." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we must consider motive in conjunction with method. A man capable of orchestrating false rain is not governed by impulse. He is deliberate, inventive, and confident in his understanding of human response." He rose once more, pacing the length of the rug. "Mass suggestion," he said softly, almost to himself. is often wetter than weather. I saw then that the case had already taken firm hold upon his formidable intellect. The rainless shower was no mere curiosity to him. It was the opening gambit of a mind that delighted in manipulation. And somewhere in London, I felt certain that mind watched and waited, secure in the belief that it had washed its crime clean with a storm that never fell. Chapter the third, The Umbrella's secret. Holmes's interest in the umbrella did not diminish with daylight. On the contrary, as the case's first excitement gave way to measured consideration, that commonplace object assumed, in his mind, the solemn importance of a blood-stained weapon. It was, he maintained, the one witness which neither gossiped nor forgot, and which could not be frightened into embellishment. A man might lie, or misremember, or persuade himself that thunder had muttered in a clear sky. Silk and steel, however, were loyal to fact. It was therefore by Holmes's express request that Inspector Bradshaw caused the umbrella to be conveyed intact to Baker Street before any zealous constable at Scotland Yard could fold it, shake it, wipe it, or otherwise rob it of its silent testimony. When it arrived at noon, it came not as an item of lost property, but as an exhibit of grave consequence, carried by a solemn-faced officer as gingerly as though it were a glass retort filled with poison. Holmes watched its passage through our doorway with a composure that concealed, only imperfectly, his keen anticipation. It was still open. The black canopy, stretched in that stubborn, defiant curve, seemed almost a living thing which had refused to relax its limbs since the moment of its owner's death. Holmes ordered it propped in the corner of the sitting room, near the window, where the pallid winter light might supplement the steady glow of our gas lamps. There it stood like a silent sentinel, casting a shallow shadow upon the carpet, and lending to the familiar room an air of unnatural gravity. An umbrella, I remarked, unable to keep a certain incredulity from my voice. Holmes's grey eyes rested upon it with the intensity he might have bestowed upon the footprints of a fugitive in fresh snow. An umbrella, Watson, said he, has served England in peace more often than any sabre. Yet when a thing is common, men cease to examine it. They forget that commonness is the murderer's favorite disguise. Inspector Bradshaw arrived within the hour. His manner, half brisk, half troubled. He had, I gathered, endured a morning of impatient superiors and sensational journalists. The Fleet Street killing, in that very district of ink and rumor, had already been pressed into half a dozen narratives, each more ridiculous than the last. He greeted Holmes with a nod of gratitude, as one might greet a man capable of imposing order upon a riot of nonsense. "You have something for me, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, glancing toward the open canopy. "I have something from you," Holmes corrected mildly, "and I propose to repay you with clarity." He approached the umbrella, not at once with his hands, but with his eyes. He moved slowly about it, altering his position by inches, pausing, leaning, withdrawing, as a jeweler might judge the cut of a stone under shifting light. I observed, as I had learned to observe through long companionship, that Holmes did not merely look. He arranged his perceptions, selecting and excluding details with conscious art. His attention could be as narrow as a needle or as wide as the horizon. The word surprised me, for I had assumed that a night alley, a sudden panic, and a dead body must have left marks of some sort upon the umbrella. Yet as Holmes spoke, I saw the justice of his remark. The exterior silk was smooth and unwrinkled, the stitching even, the ribs true. It did not bear the faint dull stippling, which even a short shower will leave upon black silk when it dries. It looked, in truth, as though it had never been opened in weather at all. "Watson," Holmes said, "stand where you stood last night, at the mouth of the alley. Imagine the witness's story true, a sudden shower, sharp and cold, sufficient to send half a dozen men scurrying under awnings. What would you expect to see upon this canopy when it is brought indoors?" "Droplet marks," I answered. "A damp edge, perhaps." "Precisely." Holmes's long forefinger traced a circle an inch above the silk, never quite touching. "Yet we have neither. There is no water, stain, no darkened seam. The umbrella is as dry as your medical texts. Therefore, unless London has invented a rain which moistens only the imagination, we may dismiss the witness's shower as we dismissed their thunder. Bradshaw shifted his weight. They were sincere enough. Of course, sincerity is an admirable virtue, Inspector, but it is a poor substitute for accuracy now. Observe the interior. He stepped behind the umbrella and, with a delicate movement, tilted it so that the gaslight fell upward into the dome. The inner lining, a paler fabric than the outer silk, revealed itself. At first I saw only the regular geometry of the ribs and the faint sheen where light caught the stretched cloth. Then Holmes adjusted the angle slightly, and I perceived what he had already detected. Faint specks, dark pinpoints beneath the ribs, arranged not in random scatter but in a subtle crescent. Holmes did not triumphantly announce his discovery. He merely looked at me, and the quiet expectation in his face compelled my attention to sharpen. "Powder," I said. "Good, and what powder?" I leaned closer. The specks were too uniform to be street dirt, too fine to be soot. They were not concentrated along the hem, as dust carried by wind might settle, but gathered higher, nearer the ribs, where fingers seldom touched. "Not ordinary grime," I murmured. "It resembles residue." Holmes nodded once, sharply, as a teacher might acknowledge a pupil's correct step. "Gunpowder residue, not the coarse. Sooty deposit one finds upon a pistol cylinder after repeated firing, but the fine bloom of discharge in immediate proximity to cloth. Note the pattern, Watson. A crescent, dense at one point, thinning as it arcs away. That is no accidental stain. It is the signature of a muzzle fired within the canopy." Inspector Bradshaw's eyes widened. Within it, Holmes lifted the umbrella by the handle and held it before his own face, the canopy shielding him from me for a moment, like the curved wall of a small tent. "Suppose," said he, his voice muffled faintly by the silk, "that a man stands thus. Umbrella open between himself and another. The dome creates a private chamber. Now suppose he raises a revolver within that chamber and fires." Even as he spoke, the picture leapt into my mind with horrifying completeness. The brief flare of the muzzle, swallowed by black silk, the report dulled by the canopy and the alley's walls, the victim seeing only a curtained darkness a foot from his eyes, the onlookers, if any, glimpsing a vague flash and hearing a sharp crack amid the manufactured patter of pellets. "The umbrella," I said slowly, "was not open to shield Mr. Harcourt from rain. It was open to conceal the shot." Holmes lowered it and regarded the crescent of residue as one might regard a decisive clue in a chemical experiment. "Exactly, a portable curtain," he observed, "drawn for a single fatal act." Bradshaw, who had taken a step closer, stared at the umbrella with renewed suspicion, as though it had changed character before his eyes. But how could Harcourt himself hold it while the murderer fired? Would he not struggle? Would he not see the assailant approach? Holmes's expression became very thoughtful. Not if the approach was conducted under the cloak of ordinary manners. Remember the setting, a narrow alley, a moment of supposed rain. A polite Londoner does not brawl in the street because another man steps close beneath an umbrella. On the contrary, the instinct is to share shelter, to draw nearer, to turn one's head aside. He moved to the table and consulted the medical notes which Bradshaw had brought. The bullet entered the chest slightly below the heart and traveled upward. No powder burns upon the clothing. Therefore, the weapon was not pressed against the body. It was held perhaps a foot away, near enough for concealment, far enough to avoid scorching. Where would such a weapon be held? Beneath the canopy's rim, angled upward. I found myself recalling the corpse's posture, the incredulous step frozen into death. "He may have taken a step backward," I said, as if startled. "Just so." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that cool satisfaction which comes not from cruelty but from understanding. He heard the patter, opened his umbrella, and in the same motion created the murderer's hiding place in that instant. Before he had even raised his eyes again, he was shot. The umbrella concealed not only the flash, but the assailant's face. A man could stand within inches of his victim and remain, for the crucial second, unseen. Then the witness's flash was the muzzle's flare, reflected faintly upon silk and brick. Holmes finished. and their supposed lightning was merely chemistry misinterpreted by startled senses. Their thunder was the report, exaggerated by fear. Their rain, the percussion of pellets upon awning or canvas, was the opening move in a carefully arranged performance. Holmes returned to the umbrella, and now, for the first time, touched it more freely. He ran his fingers along the ribs, examined the joints, and tested the runner with the lightest pressure. The mechanism moved with remarkable smoothness, neither sticking nor catching. "Curious," he murmured again, and I recognized the note. Not idle wonder, but the sharpening of inference. "What now?" asked Bradshaw. Holmes pointed to the ferrule. "The tip is freshly polished and faintly oiled. See the sheen, the threads here." He twisted the ferrule slightly. "Have been recently turned. The umbrella has been disassembled and reassembled, perhaps for cleaning, perhaps to ensure its swift opening. The runner glides without the least hesitation, and that matters because—" Bradshaw began. "Because," said Holmes patiently, "in our reconstructed scene, timing is everything. The umbrella must open cleanly at the first sign of rain. If it snagged, if it required a second attempt, if it resisted, the victim would look up, curse, and become alert. The murderer's advantage would be lost. Therefore, the instrument must be prepared to open promptly." Someone ensured that it was. Bradshaw frowned. "You think Harcourt maintained it himself?" Holmes lifted the handle toward the light. A modest silver collar bore an engraving. "It is certainly his," I said. "Ownership does not prove preparation," Holmes replied. "Men own many things they do not understand, yet we must not leap to conclusions. It is possible Harcourt, expecting rain, oiled it himself. It is also possible another had access to it. Our task is to discover which." He examined the handle minutely. "Ash wood," he murmured, "smooth. Well worn at this curve where the fingers naturally rest. The collar's engraving is recent. No tarnish in the grooves. It was ordered within the year, I should say." Bradshaw stirred impatiently, though he tried to conceal it. "Fine details, Mr. Holmes. But we must find the man who fired the shot." "We shall," Holmes said calmly, "and this umbrella will take us nearer to him than any witness ever could." He bent suddenly and sniffed near the folded pleats, then straightened. "There is a faint odor of oil, as I noted. But there is something else, something sharper. Not wet wool, Inspector. Not dampness. The faint tang of cordite. Though mixed with city soot, it is easy to miss." Bradshaw's eyes widened again. "So the weapon was fired close indeed." "Yes, and that gives us another advantage." Holmes's gaze returned to the crescent of residue. "Watson, you will recall that residue distribution may indicate the angle of discharge." I leaned closer again. The crescent was not a perfect arc. At one end it seemed slightly elongated, as though the discharge had struck more forcefully there before feathering out. "It is heavier here," I said, pointing exactly. The muzzle was angled, not squarely inward, but obliquely. The shooter was not directly opposite the victim, but slightly to his right. Perhaps approaching as though to pass him, perhaps speaking, perhaps raising his own umbrella, or stepping beneath Harcourt's. Bradshaw's face tightened. "You imply a near approach, a man close enough to share shelter. That suggests familiarity or audacity," Holmes corrected. "A stranger may be audacious, only a familiar man may be careless. We must determine which, but consider what the murderer achieved. He created a private chamber in public space. Under that canopy, he could do more than fire a shot. He could conceal a gesture, exchange an object, whisper a word. The umbrella is not merely concealment, it is a stage." His words gave me a sudden chill, for I imagined that tight circle of silk enclosing two men in the alley, one dying, one unhurried. Holmes folded the umbrella with deliberate care, as though closing not an implement but a dangerous secret. The ribs collapsed obediently. The silk fell into neat pleats. The strap fastened with a soft click. "Inspector," he said, handing it to Bradshaw, "this must be treated henceforth as a firearm would be. No one is to wipe it, polish it, or tidy it. It should be stored dry and undisturbed. And I will require, if you please, an inventory of everyone who had access to Mr. Harcourt's office within the past fortnight, including clerks, porters, cleaners, and any person who might plausibly have handled his personal effects. Bradshaw nodded, though his mind plainly raced ahead. We have begun inquiries. Harcourt was, as I told you, a publisher of pamphlets. He made enemies. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Enemies with ideology, money, or pride. All three, perhaps. He issued certain controversial tracts. There have been threats. Threats are cheap, Holmes said. This murder was expensive in forethought. The motive must be equal to the method. Bradshaw hesitated. There is one matter. Harcourt had, recently, a dispute with a partner, Mr. Silas Crowe. They quarreled over a manuscript. Holmes's expression did not change, yet I sensed his attention lock upon the name. Crowe, he repeated softly, as if tasting it. A partner, you say. That will bear examination, but do not present him as guilty merely because he quarreled. Many men quarrel and do not invent rain. Bradshaw managed a grim smile. You make it sound almost artistic. Holmes's face hardened. Artistic number. It is vanity, Inspector. A desire not only to accomplish a murder, but to demonstrate cleverness. Such vanity is a weakness, and weaknesses are the detective's best allies. When the inspector departed, taking the umbrella away as though carrying a coiled serpent, I remained by the hearth, unsettled. The object's absence seemed to leave an emptiness in the room, a gap like that which remains when a truth has been revealed, and one cannot return to ignorance. Holmes sat in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed. You are thinking of the murderer, I said. I am thinking of his mind, Holmes replied, and of Harcourt's expectation. Expectation of rain. Holmes opened his eyes and fixed me with that direct, penetrating look, which always suggested that he examined not merely my words, but the machinery behind them. Why did Harcourt open his umbrella so readily, Watson? Not because he was a man who liked shelter, because he believed, in that moment, that rain was coming. But that belief was induced. Precisely, induced by sound. A sound placed at the exact moment that requires knowledge. Knowledge of where Harcourt would walk, when he would pass the awnings, and how he would respond. Summon and followed him, I suggested. Or awaited him, Holmes corrected. And if awaited, then perhaps arranged it. Consider further, Harcourt's umbrella was in good repair. Its mechanism was smooth, its ferrule recently turned. That suggests preparation before the night. A man does not oil an umbrella in the alley at midnight. Holmes inclined his head. It is one of our most promising avenues. And there is another. The very choice of such a method implies a desire to leave behind, in plain sight, the instrument of concealment. The murderer did not take the umbrella. He left it open, like a signature. A signature, I repeated. Yes, a message. Holmes's voice was quiet, but there was a hard edge beneath it. Our opponent wishes the world to see the umbrella and think of rain. He wishes the police to waste their hours seeking clouds. He wishes the witnesses to swear to weather. It is misdirection elevated to principle. I thought of the trembling men at our door that morning, of their sincere insistence upon thunder and wet wool. And he succeeded. For the first hour, Holmes said. He succeeded for precisely as long as it takes a mind to revert from panic to analysis. That is why he chose his moment well. But he did not account for one detail. And what is that? Holmes leaned forward, his tone suddenly intent. He did not account for the simple fact that objects remember. Guns remember by their rifling, footprints remember by their depth, umbrellas remember by powder in their folds. He rose and crossed to the window outside. London wore its habitual veil of vapor, and the lamps along Baker Street floated like pale moons in the haze. A boy ran past with newspapers under his arm, crying some garbled version of last night's violence. Holmes watched him without expression. There are men, he said at last, who commit crimes in order to gain something, money, safety, revenge. And there are men who commit crimes to prove something to themselves. The latter are more dangerous, because their motive is less easily satisfied. He turned back to me, and for an instant I saw in his face not the detached logician, but the moral force which underlay his cold reasoning. Harcourt died not merely because he stood in an alley at midnight, but because he became, to a clever mind, a subject of experiment. That, Watson, is the true obscenity. I felt a flush of anger on the dead man's behalf. Then we must catch him. Holmes's mouth tightened, and his eyes shone with a steady resolve. We shall. The umbrella has answered the question of how. The false rain has explained the question of when. Now we must pursue the question of who and why. And when we do, we shall find that this portable curtain was drawn not only to hide a shot, but to conceal a chain of purpose extending far beyond one alley. He returned to his chair and took up his violin bow, not to play, but to tap it thoughtfully against his palm. A habit of his, when the mind ran ahead of the world. Mark my words, Watson, he said softly. A man who trusts so much to misdirection will, sooner or later, misdirect himself. And as the fog thickened outside and the city resumed its indifferent pulse, I found that my thoughts returned again and again to that curved dome of silk, so ordinary, so innocent in daylight, yet transformed by a single fatal act into the darkest of instruments, not a shield against weather, but a curtain behind which death had been calmly, precisely performed. Chapter Forfait, The Man from the Club. It is one of London's quieter ironies that the fiercest passions so often beat their wings behind doors marked members only. A gentleman's club, with its muffled carpets and careful voices, should by rights be a temple of restraint. Yet I have learned, in Holmes's company, that where behavior is most regulated, any breach of it is apt to become a spectacle. Men who spend their days mastering composure frequently discover, when anger escapes them, that they enjoy the sound of their own indignation. Inspector Bradshaw arrived after luncheon with news of a more substantial sort than the morning's newspapers could supply. "The dead man is Edwin Harcourt, as we supposed," said he. "But we have his movements now. He spent the early evening at the St. Bartholomew Club off the Strand. There was a quarrel, loud enough that half the card room heard it, and the alley where he was shot lies within a minute's walk of the club's rear entrance." Holmes's eyes, which had been idly following the smoke from his pipe, sharpened at once. "A quarrel, you say? With whom?" "A member named Rupert Calder," Bradshaw answered, "a retired cavalry captain, hot temper, high color, and a taste for cards. The dispute was over a sum, small enough to be contemptible in polite society, yet large enough to wound a man's pride." Holmes gave a little sound which might have been amusement or caution. Pride is often more expensive than money. Bradshaw produced a notebook. "Witnesses say Harcourt accused Calder of short dealing." Calder replied, "Well, not fit for this room. They were separated, there were threats. Calder left soon after. Harcourt remained another half hour, then departed by the back passage." "And the threats?" Holmes asked. "Half whispered. Half performed," the inspector said with reluctant precision. "Something to the effect that Calder would teach him manners, that Harcourt would regret his tongue. The usual." Holmes rose. "We shall visit the St. Bartholomew." The club sat in a narrow street of decent frontage, its brass plate polished to the point of vanity. Within, the atmosphere was a careful blend of leather, coals, smoke, and money long accustomed to itself. A porter conducted us through a corridor of oil portraits and into a small room where the secretary, Mr. Ambrose Wickett, received inquiries with the expression of a man asked to account for the weather. Holmes introduced himself with quiet authority. At the mention of Harcourt's name, Wickett's composure tightened. "A distressing matter," said he. "Mr. Harcourt was a member in good standing." "Then you will assist us," Holmes replied, "by describing his last evening here." Wickett consulted a register, and within minutes we were seated in the card. Room itself, a lofty chamber where green lamps hung low over, felt tables like domesticated moons. Two elderly members played whist in rigid silence, as though the world's disasters were irrelevant to the arrangement of suits. The scene of the quarrel was easily indicated. "It occurred there by the far table," said Wickett. "Captain Calder and Mr. Harcourt, had been playing with two others. The disagreement became unpleasant. We do not encourage unpleasantness. Holmes's gaze moved not to the table, but to the doorways, the spacing of chairs, the angle at which a man might observe without seeming to observe. Who witnessed it? Wicket named 3 men. One by one they were brought to us, each in his own turn, each with his own emphasis. A solicitor recalled Harcourt's indignation. He was quite beside himself, insisted Calder had palmed a card. I saw no such thing, but Harcourt was determined. A portly merchant remembered Calder's color. Rising, he went crimson, said Harcourt had no right to accuse him, called him a cheat and worse. There was a great deal of acting, if you ask me. A thin-faced baronet spoke chiefly of decorum. It was disgraceful. Calder leaned in close, too close, and said something under his breath. Harcourt went pale, then laughed, an ugly little laugh. Calder left abruptly. Holmes listened with politeness, yet I observed that his attention drifted away from the indignation itself toward the rhythm beneath it. The pauses, the points at which voices rose, the moments when silence fell, when the last witness had finished. Holmes asked a single question. Did either gentleman, at any point, call for rain? The baronet stared. Rain. Holmes's manner remained mild. Did Mr. Harcourt remark upon the weather? Did Captain Calder? No, the man said, bewildered. Why should they? Holmes thanked him and turned to Wicket. This rear entrance, if you please. We were shown a narrow passage leading to a service door. Outside lay the small yard behind the club, and beyond it, only a short turn, where the very lanes and alleys that knit the Strand to Fleet Street. Holmes stood a moment in the yard, looking from the door to the mouth of the passage, as though measuring the ease of a rehearsal. Convenient, he murmured. Bradshaw, who had accompanied us, seized upon the obvious. You think Calder followed him? I think, Holmes said, that you have been given a story designed to be remembered. A loud quarrel witnesses threats. A man leaving in anger. It is excellent material for the mind to seize and repeat. You believe it was staged? I asked. A quarrel may be genuine, Holmes replied, but it may also be arranged for memory's benefit. When men wish you to recall something, they will provide you with theater. Bradshaw bristled. Calder has temper enough without theater. No doubt, said Holmes. But temper alone does not invent rain where none has fallen, nor does it oil an umbrella so that it opens like clockwork. We returned indoors and requested an interview with Captain Calder. He was found in a small smoking room, a tall man with a clipped moustache and the straight back of one who had once been shouted at by sergeants. His eyes, pale and watchful, took Holmes's measure at once. So, said he, before any question was asked, you've come about Harcourt. We have, Holmes answered, and about your quarrel with him. Calder's jaw tightened. He insulted me publicly, and you threatened him. I said what any man would say when called a cheat. Holmes's voice stayed gentle, and afterwards. I left. I went home. By the front door, Calder hesitated. Only a fraction. But Holmes's gaze caught it like a hook in cloth. Of course. Holmes nodded, as though satisfied. Yet his eyes had gone colder. Captain, do you own an umbrella? Calder frowned. I beg your pardon. Humor me. I own several, like any gentleman. Holmes inclined his head. Then you will have no objection to telling Inspector Bradshaw where you were at midnight. Calder's color rose, not with the explosive anger described by witnesses, but with something tighter and more controlled. This is impertinence. It is inquiry, Holmes corrected, and impertinence is sometimes the price of truth. As we left the club, Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the pavement as though it contained a diagram. At last he spoke. The club gives us proximity, and it gives us a candidate, but it also gives us something else. What is that? I asked. A rehearsal space, said Holmes quietly. When convenience serves rehearsal, Watson, Suspicion should be very slow to applaud. Chapter vif dust in the gutter Holmes is seldom more formidable than when London still sleeps. In those grey hours before commerce wakes and conscience grows noisy, he moves through the city as if it were a laboratory left unattended. Every surface undisturbed, every trace honest. It was therefore at his insistence that we returned to the alley off Fleet Street at dawn, when the lamps still burned weakly and the sky wore the colour of unpolished pewter. Inspector Bradshaw had offered men, lanterns, and authority. Holmes declined them all. "A crowd," said he, drawing his coat close against the morning chill, "is the worst instrument for delicate work. Their boots would write their own story over the earths. We took instead a plain hansom and were set down at the mouth of the passage while the street sweepers were still distant silhouettes. Fleet Street itself, so brazen by day, murmured now like a creature half. Asleep, the alley lay before us as we had left it, narrow, hemmed by brick, with refuse clinging in the corners like old gilt. Yet there is a difference between midnight darkness and dawn dimness, and it was in that difference that Holmes expected the alley to confess. He stepped within as though crossing a threshold into a private room, his eyes lowered at once, not to where Harcourt had fallen, but to the gutter line that ran along the base of the left-hand wall. I followed, feeling anew the chill that had struck me the previous night when I first beheld the dead man's shape upon the stones. "The corpse has gone," I said, more to fill the silence than from any need of remark. Holmes gave an absent nod. "The body is an event, Watson. The ground is the record of the event." He crouched, his long figure folding with ease, and drew from his pocket a small magnifying lens. In one gloved hand, he held a narrow strip of stiff paper, no doubt cut from some forgotten envelope, which he used as a blade to lift and separate the grime in the gutter. To my untrained eye, the dust was dust, grey, shapeless, inevitable. To Holmes, it was as legible as print. "A true rainfall," said he softly, "would have done three things." I waited. It would have darkened the dust where it lay. It would have carried the lighter matter down into the gutter in tiny streams, and it would have deposited new sediment. Clean, sharp grains where the water slowed. He moved the lens along the gutter edge with exquisite patience. "Yet we find none of these. Look here." He indicated a patch where the grime lay thickest. Even in the poor light, I could see that its surface was smooth and continuous, like old powder laid carefully and undisturbed. "It is untouched," I said. "Exactly, ancient, as you aptly phrased it. The earth keeps its own diary, Watson, and tonight it records drought." He traced a finger lightly along the edge and held up his glove. Fine powder clung to it, pale against the dark leather. You see, this coating had rain truly fallen. Even briefly, it would have caked, not dusted. It would have formed tiny beads and rivulets. He straightened and crossed to the center of the alley, where a faint discoloration on the stones marked the place Harcourt had bled. He did not look long at it. Instead, he turned his attention to the cobbles around it, particularly the spaces between stones where grit collects and secrets linger. "Yesterday," said he, "we proved that no water fell. Today we must discover what did." He knelt again, and with the tip of his paper strip, scraped gently at a crack between two cobbles. A small heap of pale granules accumulated. Holmes examined it under the lens, then transferred a pinch to a folded square of clean paper. "That is not ordinary street dust," I ventured. "No," he replied, with the quiet satisfaction of a man confirming a hypothesis. "It is too uniform, too rounded at the edge. Observe." He handed me the lens. Through it, the grains appeared like miniature pearls of chalk, small, pale, and suspiciously regular. "They resemble," I began, "the pellets one might purchase for a child's sling." Holmes finished. "Or more likely the residue of something sold in quantity." "What could that be?" Holmes rose and moved toward the alley's mouth, where an awning extended over a print shop doorway. He looked up at it, then at the stones beneath, then at the gutter again. "A canvas, awning," he mused. "Taut, resonant, A handful of small objects cast upon it would produce exactly the pattering sound of sudden rain. You have already suggested as much. Yes, but now I intend to know what objects and from where. He stepped beneath the awning and examined its underside. In the daylight's faintness, it was merely stained canvas. Holmes, however, ran his fingers along a seam and drew them away with a slight grimace. "Grit," he said. I drew nearer and saw that in the folds where the canvas met its support, a thin line of pale dust had collected, as though something had struck from above and shaken down a residue. Holmes smiled faintly, and for the first time that morning his manner held the keen amusement which, in him, always preceded a useful deduction. "The murder's stagehands were careless," said he. "They have left sawdust in the theater." "Sawdust," I echoed. "Not literally, but residue. If the pellets were thrown, some would rebound, some would shatter, some would lodge. The canvas preserves what the cobbles might scatter." He produced a small handkerchief, scraped delicately at the fold, and secured another pinch of the pale material. "Chalk," I said, sniffing at it. "Or lime." Holmes's eyes flicked to mine. "Excellent. Your medical nostrils are not wasted. Lime has a dryness and bitterness which chalk lacks. This," he lifted the handkerchief to the light, "is nearer to lime than chalk, and lime is used in plaster," Holmes said, "and in mortar, also in certain bleaching processes, and," he added, "in the treatment of paper. Fleet Street." Holmes reminded me, with a glance toward the dim line of offices. "Ink and paper, presses and pulp. Men who handle paper know lime as surgeons know carbolic." He paused, then seemed to dismiss the line of thought for the moment, his mind already running along several tracks at once. "Let us return to Harcourt," he said, as though turning a page. We walked to the spot where the body had lain. Holmes stood there and looked down, not at the blood stain, but at the angle of approach one might take into the alley. "Here," he murmured. He entered from Fleet Street, walking toward the darker end. He would have heard the patter above. He would have lifted his umbrella. Thus, Holmes pantomimed the motion with a subtlety that made it unexpectedly vivid. In that fraction of a second his head dipped, his shoulders hunched slightly, his eyes turned inward. The gesture itself was a small surrender, a man's brief concession to weather. And as he did, Holmes continued, his attention narrowed, "That is when our murderer stepped close." He moved a pace to the right. "Here," slightly offset, as the residue pattern suggests. The revolver raised within the canopy, the shot fired upward. He looked around, as if expecting the brick to replay what it had witnessed. Then he crouched again, this time beside the place where Harcourt's feet had been. "His boots," Holmes said quietly. "Bradshaw brought them to me yesterday evening, but I had not yet compared them with the scene in daylight." From his pocket, he drew a small notebook and a strip of paper upon which he had evidently taken impressions. He compared them now to the cobbles. "He stepped once," Holmes said, "after the shot. Not forward, not away. One incredulous step, as though his body attempted to obey a command already cancelled. I found myself swallowing against the memory of that posture." Holmes turned his attention to the stones near the right-hand wall. "And the murderer, did he step?" He moved the lens along the cracks, pausing, adjusting, as though listening with his eyes. Presently he gave a soft, satisfied sound. "Here," he said, in a shallow layer of grime between cobbles was the faintest distortion, a partial impression that a casual glance would have dismissed as accident. Under the lens, however, it resolved into the edge of a boot tread. Holmes measured it with a tiny ruler he produced from his case. Narrow heel, worn at the outer edge, a man who turns his foot outward slightly. "The illusion of rain," he said softly, "was manufactured entirely in the minds of men. The ground rejects it, the canvas rejects it. Only memory embraces it." He let the dust fall from his glove in a thin grey stream. "And now," he concluded, "we shall see who profits when men remember what never happened." With that he turned away, already moving toward the next stage of the chase, while behind us the alley lay silent, its gutters full of ancient grime, its stones dry as old paper, and its dust keeping, with pitiless fidelity, the diary of a night in which rain had been summoned like a ghost and then dismissed, leaving only murder to prove it had ever been called. Chapter v. The flash that no one saw. Holmes maintained that the case had become, in the public mind, a matter of weather, and that until we robbed it of that false romance, we should never bring it back to reason. Men, said he, will forgive a miracle more readily than a method. To that end he resolved to reconstruct the murder, not in the yard, where every constable would contribute a theory, but in our sitting room, where he could control light, sound, and attention as carefully as he controlled his own thoughts. He turned Baker Street into a small theater of deception. A strip of canvas, borrowed from Mrs. Hudson with many apologies and no explanation, was propped upon chairs to mimic an awning. An umbrella of similar size to Harcourt's stood ready. Holmes drew the curtains until the room lay in a soft dusk, the gaslight reduced to a pale glow. When Inspector Bradshaw arrived, his skepticism was obvious, but curiosity held him in place. "You will show me how honest men swore to lightning," he said. "I will show you," Holmes replied, "how expectation supplies its own weather." He placed me near the door. "Watson, you are our witness. Stand as they stood, at the alley's mouth. Do not hunt for details. Receive impressions. That is what they did." Bradshaw took his place beside me. Holmes stepped several paces away, then advanced as though walking into the alley. With his free hand he shook the canvas sharply. A dry, rapid patter filled the room, so like hard rain on taut fabric that my eyes flicked upward before I could prevent it. "Thus," Holmes said, "the mind is nudged. It hears a familiar sound and leaps to a familiar cause." He opened the umbrella in a swift motion. The canopy rose like a black wall, narrowing his outline and masking his face. In that instant, he became anonymous. "Now imagine Harcourt," Holmes continued, his voice calm. "He hears the rain, opens his umbrella, and lowers his head a fraction. His vision narrows. He is enclosed in silk and shadow. Into that narrow chamber steps a second man, close enough to share shelter, close enough to be mistaken for a passer, by caught in sudden weather." Bradshaw frowned. "Close enough to be struck. If there were time," Holmes corrected. "But the method is designed to deny time." Beneath the canopy, Holmes's hand moved, invisible to us. Then a fierce white glare burst against the umbrella's interior and vanished at once. It was a lantern with a shutter. Holmes showed it afterward, but at the moment my eyes watered, and my mind supplied the word lightning before reason could object. Holmes let the darkness settle again. "You saw a flash," he said. "I did," I admitted. "And you knew it was no storm," he replied gently. "Yet your nerves obeyed the illusion. Now add the report." He struck the poker sharply upon the hearth. The crack echoed in the dim room with surprising violence. Flash and sound together, light and bang, produced even in safety a primitive conviction. "Storm." To startled bystanders, Holmes said, "a muzzle flare inside an umbrella becomes lightning. A pistol's report in a narrow alley becomes thunder. Their senses do not lie, their interpretation does." Bradshaw's Calder's jaw set. I had reason. And the quarrels occurred at nearly the same hour. We play cards at that hour. Am I to be blamed for habit? Holmes nodded. Habit is useful. It provides predictability. Predictability provides rehearsal. Calder's color rose. "You imply." "I observe," Holmes said mildly. "And I observe something else. You have recently purchased a revolver." For the first time, Calder's outrage faltered into something tighter, alarm concealed beneath insult. His eyes flicked, for a fraction of a second, to Bradshaw. Bradshaw stepped forward. "We have the record, Captain. Purchased at Tranter's in Wigmore Street 2 weeks ago, a small revolver, easy to conceal. Am I forbidden to protect myself? London is not what it was." Holmes's voice remained gentle, which made it all the more cutting. "Protection is a right, but tell me why a weapon small enough to hide in a sleeve? A larger pistol would serve protection better. A smaller pistol serves concealment." Calder laughed, but the sound was thin. You are twisting common sense into suspicion. Common sense, Holmes replied, does not rehearse quarrels for 3 nights, so that witnesses will swear to them on the 4th. Calder stepped nearer, his hands clenched. I am a gentleman. Harcourt insulted me, I answered, as any man would. As any man would, Holmes repeated softly. Yet, not any man chooses his words as though they were written. Not any man ensures that different witnesses hear the same lines. Not any man leaves behind a neat motive tied with a bow. Calder's face worked, as though competing instincts, rage, fear, pride, struggled for dominance. At last he forced himself into a rigid composure. You have no proof, he said. Holmes inclined his head. Not yet, but your indignation rings hollow. Captain outrage is loud when it is true. When it is acted, it overplays itself. Bradshaw made a note. We'll require your movements on the night of Harcourt's death. Captain exact times. Calder's eyes narrowed. I left by the front door. I went home. Holmes's gaze held him. And did you ever leave by the rear? Calder's answer came too quickly. Number Holmes did not challenge him then. He merely accepted the word as one accepts a coin whose weight will be tested later. We departed the club and walked in silence for some minutes. The fog swallowing the street behind us, at last I spoke. You believe the quarrel was arranged to point toward Calder? Holmes's mouth tightened. I believe it was arranged to point toward someone. Calder may be villain, pawn, or shield. But the rehearsal tells us this. The murderer did not prepare merely a crime. He prepared the memory of one. And that implies planning, I said. Planning of a particular kind, Holmes replied. A mind that thinks not only of acts, but of what others will recall of them. Such a mind builds narratives, the way it builds traps, so that the victim walks into them willingly. He paused beneath a lamp whose light fell weakly through mist. When witnesses speak with suspicious fidelity, Watson, it is often because they have been taught what to say without knowing they were taught. I felt again that unpleasant sense of being watched which had crept over me since the alley. Then Calder's public anger may be genuine, Holmes admitted. But if it was genuine, it has been used. And if it was staged, then it is evidence of something worse than temper, collaboration with a design. Bradshaw, trudging beside us, muttered, Either way, he's in the net. Holmes shook his head. Not yet. A rehearsed accident is still an accident until you find the hand that rehearsed it. We have learned that someone planted a motive where none might have been believed. Now we must learn who needed the planting, and why. He glanced back toward the club's discreet doorway. The next step is simple. We shall verify the revolver, verify the purchase, and verify the captain's route. If his story is another performance, London Stones will remember where his boots truly went. Then in that low, thoughtful tone he used when a conclusion had settled into certainty, he added, He prepared not merely a crime, Watson, but the memory of one. Chapter the 8th Powder, and Pride Holmes's decision to visit Captain Calder's lodgings was reached with that quiet finality which admitted no debate. Bradshaw, who had hoped to proceed by formal summons and measured warrants, found himself once again compelled to match Holmes's pace rather than set it. There is a difference, Holmes remarked, as we drove westward in a cab that rattled over the morning stones, between what a man will declare under accusation and what he will leave behind him when he believes himself unobserved. Speech is a performance. Rooms are confessions. Calder lodged in Jermyn Street, in a respectable house where the carpeted stair and the polished banister suggested the careful self-regard of its tenants. The landlady, one of those brisk women who combine devotion to propriety with an eagerness for scandal, received Inspector Bradshaw with flustered alacrity and Holmes with instant resentment, as though she recognized the detective's talent for discovering disorder beneath ordered surfaces. Captain Calder is out, sir, she insisted, smoothing her apron as if it were a shield. A gentleman, Mr. Holmes. Quiet as a mouse. He is. No trouble. A mouse, Holmes repeated, looking at her steadily. We'll still leave crumbs. We shall be brief. Bradshaw produced his authority, and within minutes we stood at Calder's door. Holmes entered as though he belonged there, his gaze taking in the arrangement at a sweep, coat stand, small table, military prints on the wall, a row of boots aligned with obsessive care. It was a room made to express discipline. Yet discipline, I have learned, may be as much mask as virtue. Holmes did not begin with drawers or desk. He began with air. He stood still, head slightly raised, nostrils faintly flaring like a man listening with a different sense. "Cordit," he said softly. Bradshaw scoffed. "You can smell cordit in a gentleman's rooms in Jermyn Street?" Holmes lifted a hand to silence him and crossed to the washstand. A basin, a shaving brush, a clean towel folded with military neatness, everything in its place. Yet Holmes's fingers went at once to a small rag on the lower shelf, the sort of cloth a man might use to polish boots or clean metal. He held it to the light, then to his nose. "Faint," he observed, "but unmistakable. The scent of burnt propellant does not belong in a room unless a firearm has recently been fired, or cleaned after firing." Bradshaw's face hardened, searched the place. 2 constables, waiting below, were summoned and began a methodical examination. Holmes, however, had already moved on. He approached the fireplace, where a set of brushes and a tin of blacking stood in dignified order. His fingers drifted over them, paused at a narrow metal box half, hidden behind the great tools, and drew it out. Inside were cleaning implements, a thin rod, a small bottle of oil, and a bundle of cloth patches. Holmes held one patch up. It bore a faint dark smear and, more curious still, a few pale fibers clinging to its edge. "Watson," said he, handing it to me, "your eyes are younger than mine at such close work." The fibers were fine, almost silky, and of a pale hue. They reminded me, with a sudden unpleasant certainty, of the umbrella lining we had examined under gaslight. "They resemble umbrella fabric," I said. "Just so," Holmes replied. "Not merely any fabric, but the particular sort used in inner linings, light, tight weave. And they have adhered to a cloth which has been used to wipe gun, metal. That is a coincidence too obedient to be trusted." Bradshaw leaned in. "You think he fired beneath the umbrella and then cleaned the revolver with this?" "I think," Holmes corrected, "that someone did." He opened a drawer of the writing desk and found, after a moment's search, a small revolver wrapped in oiled paper. It was a neat weapon, compact and almost elegant in its brutality. Precisely the sort one might hide within a sleeve or beneath a coat's fold. Its surface gleamed, polished with care. Yet Holmes's eyes, as always, went where polish fails. He tilted it to the light and smiled faintly. "Wiped," said he, "but not perfectly." He produced his lens and examined the grooves around the cylinder and the narrow angles where metal met metal. In those recesses, a faint darkening remained, powder residue tracing the lines like guilt unwilling to depart. "Even a careful man," Holmes remarked, "will miss what he cannot easily see. Pride makes him think he has done the job. Haste makes him leave the last truth behind." Bradshaw's voice was low. "Enough for arrest." "Enough," Holmes agreed, "for pressure. But I should like certainty, Inspector, certainty that will not dissolve under cross-examination." The constables reported from the bedroom. A new umbrella, still in its paper sleeve, lay in the wardrobe. The landlady, when pressed, admitted that it had been delivered only yesterday afternoon. Holmes took it from its wrapping and examined the collar. No initials, no wear. The silk stiff with newness. "Purchased that very day," he murmured. Bradshaw stared. "Then Harcourt's umbrella." "Was not Harcourt's at all," Holmes said quietly. "Or at least, not the umbrella used in the shot. We assumed the initials settled it. But an engraving can be arranged. A collar can be swapped. The murderer wished you to believe it belonged to the victim, because that makes the opening of it seem natural. Yet here, in Calder's wardrobe, we find the truth. He equipped himself. I felt the pieces shift in my mind with a click like a lock turning. He needed an umbrella that would open smoothly, at the precise moment, and one he could control," Holmes added. "If the umbrella is his, he can raise it to conceal his arm. He can angle it so that the flash dies inside. He can ensure the residue falls where it must. the victim becomes merely the man who stands opposite. Bradshaw's eyes narrowed. But our earlier finding, the collar engraved A. Holmes's smile was thin. A simple exchange. There are engravers in London who will put 2 letters on silver for a few shillings, and no questions asked. There are also men who keep old collars and fittings. I would wager that A was planted to pin the umbrella to Harcourt and make the scene appear like an unlucky reflex. He turned the new umbrella in his hands as though weighing not silk, but motive. And motive, he said, is where pride and cowardice begin their dance. We waited in the front parlor while Bradshaw arranged the necessary orders. Calder returned within the hour, his boots striking the stair with confident emphasis. He entered the room briskly, stopped short at the sight of uniform, and then, recognizing Holmes, let his face harden into prepared outrage. "This is an outrage," he snapped. "What is the meaning?" Holmes rose smoothly. "The meaning, Captain, is that your quarrel was a performance, your umbrella, a curtain, and your pistol a prop." Calder's eyes flashed. "You have no right." Holmes held up the cleaning cloth. "Cord it," he said quietly. "And fibers from an umbrella lining you fired recently." Calder began, then checked himself, his jaw clamping shut. Holmes held up the revolver. Wiped but not perfectly, powder remains where pride believed none could be seen. Calder's nostrils flared. "Any man may own a revolver, and any man may buy an umbrella," Holmes replied, lifting the new one from the table. "Purchased yesterday afternoon." "Why, Captain?" "Because the old one would not do. Because you required smoothness, reliability, a canopy wide enough to hide your arm." Calder's face had gone a shade paler beneath the moustache, yet even then his pride fought for air. "Harcourt insulted me," he said, voice tight. "He called me a cheat." "And you could not endure it," Holmes said. Pride demanded a duel of words, but cowardice insisted upon concealment. Bradshaw stepped forward. "You're under arrest for the murder of Edwin Harcourt." Calder's hands clenched. For an instant I thought he might lunge, or collapse, or attempt some desperate flight. But the discipline of his life, real or performed, held him rigid. He stood very still, eyes fixed on Holmes with a mixture of hatred and something like dread. Holmes, for his part, regarded him without triumph, only with that cold sorrow which always came to him when intellect was used for cruelty. "You relied on spectacle," Holmes continued, almost conversationally. "To absolve you, you planted a quarrel for witnesses to repeat. You summoned a false storm for their minds to inhabit. You trusted that men would remember thunder and forget hands." Calder's voice came out raw. "They would have, if not for you." Holmes inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a point of etiquette. "Men believe what flatters drama," he said, "especially when it thunders." Bradshaw led Calder away. The landlady wept noisily in the hall, either from genuine shock or from the fear that respectability had been wounded beneath her roof. When the house had quieted and the footsteps faded, I turned to Holmes. "It is done," I said. Holmes shook his head, gaze distant. "Not yet, Watson. We have proved Calder's tools and his rehearsed memory. But a method such as this has more than one moving part. The false rain, the window above the awning, the careful timing, these may be within one man's capacity. Yet I do not like the geometry of it. It is too clean. You suspect an accomplice." "I suspect," Holmes replied, "that pride rarely works alone. And if Calder's pride demanded a spectacle, then someone helped arrange the stage." He took the cleaning cloth once more and studied the pale fibers, as though they were threads in a larger tapestry. "Powder and pride," he murmured. "They cling, however much one wipes." Chapter XA, closing the canopy. Holmes has long preferred the drawing room to the dock. A courtroom may condemn a man, but it is in the quiet, controlled atmosphere of Baker Street that guilt first begins to breathe unevenly. It was therefore by Holmes's design, not Inspector Bradshaw's, that Captain Rupert Calder was invited to 221B under the polite pretense of clarifying certain details before formal proceedings advanced. The captain came punctually. He entered with the stiff composure of a man determined to meet accusation with hauteur. His gloves were immaculate, his moustache carefully set, his expression one of offended dignity. If he felt the tightening circle about him, he concealed it behind the manners of a gentleman affronted. Holmes received him with courtesy. "I am obliged to you for attending, Captain. Pray be seated." Upon the central table lay the umbrella. It was folded now, its black silk bound neatly with its strap, as innocent in appearance as any article one might leave in a hall. Stand. Yet there was about it an air of expectancy, as though it knew it would soon be called upon to speak. Calder's gaze fell upon it for the briefest instant before returning to Holmes. "You have made your accusations," he said evenly. "I deny them." Holmes inclined his head. "Denial is often a necessary preliminary. Let us examine facts instead." He remained standing, one long hand resting lightly upon the umbrella. "You relied, Captain, upon rain that never fell." Calder's jaw tightened. "I have no notion what you mean." Holmes's voice was calm, almost conversational. The witnesses heard pattering upon canvas. They assumed rain, they sought shelter in that confusion. A shot was fired. Some swore they saw lightning, others recalled thunder. One even imagined the smell of wet wool. Yet the gutters did not run, the dust did not cake. The earth, as it happens, keeps better records than men. Calder said nothing. His eyes had drifted, against his will, toward the object on the table. Holmes continued. "You mistook illusion for evidence. You believed that if men remembered a storm, they would forget a hand. But sensation is not proof. Objects are loyal witnesses." He unfastened the strap and, with deliberate care, opened the umbrella. The canopy rose smoothly, obedient as a trained creature. Holmes angled it toward the hearthlight, allowing the glow to fall upward into its interior. The pale lining caught the light, and there, unmistakable, lay the crescent bloom of dark residue beneath the ribs. Calder's composure wavered. The color drained from his face, leaving the moustache stark against pallid skin. Holmes's voice did not rise. "Gunpowder, Captain. Fired within the canopy, the flash swallowed by silk, the smoke redirected, a portable curtain drawn for a single act." Calder's fingers twitched on the arms of his chair. "That proves nothing. Anyone." "Anyone," Holmes agreed gently, "might fire a revolver, but not anyone prepares 3 evenings of quarrel so that witnesses will rehearse motive on the 4th. Not anyone purchases a compact weapon, wipes it imperfectly, and cleans it with a cloth that retains fibers from this lining. Not anyone arranges for pellets of lime to rattle upon an awning at precisely the moment required." At that, Calder's eyes flashed with something more than fear, something like resentment that the elegance of his design had been penetrated. Holmes saw it and pressed on. "You counted upon drama," he said. "You trusted that thunder would be remembered more vividly than geometry. But geometry does not lie." The bullet traveled upward, the residue formed a crescent. The dust lay undisturbed. Each fact contradicted your storm. Calder rose abruptly. "You cannot prove I held that umbrella." Holmes stepped aside, holding it between them. "I need not prove you held it," he replied. "I need only show that the man who did so fired from within it, and that man possessed your revolver, your cloth, your fibers, and your motive." There was a long silence. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels grinding faintly against the street. Within the room, the umbrella's curved interior seemed almost to press forward, as though its dark bloom were an accusation given form. Calder's shoulders, which had remained rigid, sagged by a fraction. Pride still struggled within him, but its footing had grown uncertain. "It was an insult," he muttered hoarsely. "He called me a cheat." Holmes' gaze was steady. "And so you chose concealment over confrontation." Pride demanded spectacle. Cowardice required a curtain. Calder's lips parted, then closed again. No denial followed. Holmes held the umbrella a moment longer, ensuring that the crescent stain was fully visible in the hearthlight. Ensuring, perhaps, that Calder saw not merely fabric, but the collapse of his illusion. "You mistook illusion for evidence." Holmes repeated softly. But objects are loyal witnesses. They do not applaud drama, they record it. Then, with deliberate finality, he snapped the canopy shut. The sound was sharp in the quiet room, an abrupt crack of collapsing ribs and tightened silk. It echoed against the walls like a judge's gavel concluding argument. Calder flinched. Holmes fastened the strap and laid the umbrella flat upon the table. "The performance is over, Captain." Inspector Bradshaw, who had stood silent near the door throughout the exchange, stepped forward. Calder did not resist this time. Whatever defiance had sustained him had drained away with the closing of the canopy. As the inspector led him out, Holmes remained by the hearth, his face composed but grave. When the door had shut and the tread upon the stairs faded, I spoke at last. "It is finished." Holmes regarded the folded umbrella. "Yes," he said quietly. "The rain has ceased." Chapter X Fay. The case of clear skies. It is a curious thing that men who can rehearse a lie for days will often lose it in a single minute when the script is torn from their hands. There are confessions which arrive like a flood, violent, desperate, and incoherent. And there are those which seep, steadily and almost gratefully, from a mind that has grown weary of performance. Captain Rupert Calder's belonged to the latter kind. Once the first denial had broken, the rest followed with an inevitability which reminded me of a stage curtain falling. The audience sees in that simple descent that the play is over, and that no amount of posture can restore the illusion. Inspector Bradshaw took him that same evening, and though I did not attend the formal statement at the yard, Holmes insisted on receiving the particulars as soon as they were reduced to paper. He had a distaste for second-hand drama, but an intense respect for confirmed fact. When Bradshaw arrived, it was with the air of a man whose impatience has at last been rewarded, and whose pride is obliged, however reluctantly, to share its satisfaction. "He has confessed," said Bradshaw, taking the chair Holmes indicated. Holmes merely inclined his head, as though this were the natural continuation of an experiment. "The motive?" "Pride," Bradshaw answered, with a grim twist of the mouth. "And money, in the way money so often oils pride's hinges." Harcourt accused him, publicly, of cheating at cards. Calder swore he had not, but the accusation spread. He said he could not bear the thought of that word following him. "Cheat," whispered in every room he entered. Holmes's fingers steepled. So the quarrel was genuine. Bradshaw hesitated. Genuine in emotion, but staged in form. He admitted that after the first dispute, he realized how useful it was, how easily it would be remembered. So he repeated it. Twice more, same hour, same table, same lines, so that different men would hear, and later repeat them. He wanted witnesses to swear, before ever a body was found, that he had motive enough to kill. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. He prepared not merely a crime, Inspector, but the memory of one. Bradshaw nodded. "Exactly your words." He said he wished the police to believe the murder sprang from heat rather than design. A man in rage does not set traps. He strikes and flees. Calder wanted to look like a man who had lost control. "And yet," Holmes murmured, "everything about the method was control." Bradshaw leaned forward. He chose the umbrella because it solved two problems at once. It concealed him, and it transformed the flash. He fired upward beneath the canopy, so the muzzle flare died in silk. Anyone who caught a glimpse of light would call it lightning. Anyone who heard the shot in that narrow place would call it thunder. He relied on witnesses to do the imaginative labor for him. Holmes's mouth tightened, not in triumph, but in that quiet distaste he always displayed when intellect was used to excuse cruelty. And the rain. Bradshaw produced a folded note. Lime pellets. He obtained them from a printer's supply, said he knew enough about Fleet Street to find the material. He dropped them onto the awning from the upstairs window of the print shop. He had bribed the night watchman, with drink and coin, to leave the window unlatched. As he put it, the patter sent the men at the alley mouth under cover. It also made Harcourt open his umbrella at once. "And after he fired?" I asked. Bradshaw's eyes went to me. He stepped away in the confusion, folded the umbrella, and left it open near the body to make it look like Harcourt's. He had swapped the collar, had the initials engraved and fixed them on, just as you predicted, Holmes. He wanted everyone to say, Harcourt opened his umbrella against rain and was shot. A neat story, a dramatic one. Holmes's expression softened for an instant. Neat stories are rarely true. Bradshaw's voice grew harder. He admitted that the method pleased him. He spoke of it as if it were a clever trick at a dinner table when I told him a man was dead. He said. The inspector paused, as though reluctant to repeat it. He said Harcourt should not have accused a gentleman. Holmes's eyes flashed. A gentleman, he echoed quietly, and the word in his mouth became an indictment rather than a title. There was silence for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, Baker Street hummed with its usual indifferent life. Cabs, footsteps, vendors, each sound a reminder that the world continues regardless of any single act of violence. At length Holmes spoke again, and now his tone was the one I knew so well, calm, methodical, and pitilessly clear. Let us put it in order, Watson, as one should always put such matters in order. A crime is a chain. To understand it, one must touch every link. He rose and paced slowly, as if each step marked a point in his reasoning. First, the motive. Calder's pride was struck at the club. Harcourt's accusation, true or false, became intolerable to him. But pride alone does not dictate method. It merely supplies impulse. Calder's greater danger lay in his vanity, his desire not only to remove Harcourt, but to do so in a manner that would vindicate him in the eyes of others. Therefore, he required a narrative. Holmes held up one finger. Second, the narrative. He staged quarrels on successive nights, repeating his lines until they could be repeated by witnesses. He wished men to recall before any investigation began that Calder had threatened Harcourt. Thus suspicion would fall where he placed it, upon temper rather than upon design. A second finger. Third, the mechanism of rain. He knew Harcourt's route from the club's rear entrance to Fleet Street. He selected the alley because of its awnings and its narrow walls. He arranged lime pellets to be dropped upon canvas, producing the sound of sudden rain. That sound primed the witnesses and compelled Harcourt to raise an umbrella at precisely the required moment. A third finger. Fourth, the umbrella's use. The raised canopy narrowed the victim's awareness, masked the murderer's arm, and swallowed the muzzle flash. Any brief glare was interpreted as lightning. The shot's report, in the confined space, suggested thunder. The witnesses, startled and already sheltering, supplied the storm with their own expectation. Holmes's gaze moved to the table, where, even now, the folded umbrella lay like a quiet reproach. Fifth, the lie betrayed by the city. The gutters did not run. The dust did not cake. The brick was dry. No hem was darkened. No brim wept. London, for all its smoke and noise, keeps accurate records. The earth remembers where men forget. He stopped, facing us. That is why the case could never remain a matter of testimony alone. Testimony is a reed in the wind. The gutter is stone. Bradshaw gave a short, unwilling laugh. You make it sound simple. Now it's done. It is always simple, Holmes replied. Once the right facts are arranged in the right order. The difficulty lies in resisting the wrong order, especially when it is so theatrically offered. Bradshaw rose to go, his duty calling him back to the yard and its mountains of paperwork. At the door he paused. There will be trial, of course, but the evidence is solid. Your umbrella stain, your dust, the revolver, he cannot wriggle from it. Holmes inclined his head. Then the matter is closed. When Bradshaw had gone, I found Holmes standing at the window looking out into the late evening. The sky above London was unusually clear, the fog lifted for once, and the stars shone with a cold steadiness that seemed almost moral. Holmes regarded that clarity with faint amusement, as though it were a quiet joke at the expense of human complication. Watson, said he, without turning, do you see the irony? That a false storm solved by clear skies, I suggested. He smiled slightly. That and more. Calder believed he could command perception as a stage. Manager commands light, and for a moment, he succeeded. Men ducked under awnings and swore to rain that never fell. They heard thunder in the crack of a pistol and saw lightning in a flare of chemistry. Yet the city brick dust gutter refused to applaud. He turned from the window and, crossing to the table, laid his hand upon the folded umbrella. For an instant his long fingers rested there, as they might upon the head of a tired animal. There is, he mused, no weather so deceptive as the human mind. With that, he snapped the strap tighter and set the umbrella aside, as though concluding a chapter in an old ledger. The object which had never met rain had served its brief masquerade, and was now reduced to what it had always been. Silk, ribs, and a handle, innocent in itself, guilty only in the hands that had used it. And thus the case ended, not with thunder, but with quiet. The culprit was led away. The rehearsed narratives collapsed beneath unscripted truth, and London streets continued under skies that had been clear all along. Clear enough for a man with eyes like Holmes to read, in dust and silence, the honest record of a storm that had never been.